Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, and that is for the 22nd, where I wanted to talk a little bit more about the story of an hour as well as A Rose for Emily. And if you'll remember, I had indicated that it looked like we had an addition to the class, a late add, so I wanted to slow down a little bit with the syllabus. Thus far, I've only heard from one student, however, in the discussion forum. So I guess I'll know by the ending of this week if we are going to be remaining at one, though my hope is that we will have at least two. But again, in order to participate in this class, you would need to respond to discussion forum questions. So I'm eagerly awaiting to see if our ad will be able to respond to the discussion forum questions that have been posted previously. For the story of an hour, I had talked a little bit about that story in terms of annotation, being able to write notes in the text, because eventually you will be writing your own responses to three of the short stories in the short story unit. I also talked a little bit about reader influences, the idea that your interpretation could be influenced by your background. For instance, your gender or your ethnicity or your socioeconomic status or your age, which shows that there is a certain level of bias in terms of literary interpretation. But that ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to identify evidence within the text to support our position, even though our position might have some bias within it. And as long as there's evidence in the text so that the position is a possibility, then ultimately that would be valid for an interpretation. And we talked about looking at things like the author and the date and the title, and in terms of understanding a piece. And for this, The Story of an Hour, written by Kate Chopin, the date 1894, and life would be quite different for female in 1894. And we're given the story of female, Mrs. Mallard, who believes that her husband has died in an accident. And during this time period, a woman was basically entirely dependent upon a male, for legal as well as financial reasons. So someone in Mrs. Mallard's position would not be able to vote, would not be able to own property, would not be financially independent, unless, of course, she became a widow and there were no heirs. And notice that there is no discussion of children in this story. So this is one of the reasons why Mrs. Mallard experiences a kind of epiphany when she realizes that her husband is gone, and she does mourn on some level, but she also celebrates on another level because now she has the possibility of freedom and independence in a way that she would never have had before in 1894. And even though A Sorrowful Woman was written quite a bit later in the 1970s, note the similarities in themes between the two about the idea of repressed and trapped female, which is not too surprising because Kate Chopin helped to establish this with Story of an Hour. So if you've got a author like a Gail Godwin with a PhD in English writing A Sorrowful Woman, it wouldn't at all be surprising that she was quite familiar with A Story of an Hour, so that she would be inspired by that to give her own update or her own interpretation. In this life-changing hour, it's only a page and a half, but it goes to show how quickly a life can change. And Mrs. Mallard is an important name. Mallard is a bird. It's a very common duck. Kate Chopin likes to use bird imagery in her writing. I'm aware of that through her other texts. But even in this text, we have references to mallards and sparrows. The idea that female can be connected to the symbolism associated with bird, being entrapped in a cage, but also released from the cage, then one could spread its wings. And the idea that a mallard is a common bird and a sparrow is a common bird suggests that this is also a common situation for female, feeling entrapped or being entrapped and not even realizing there is entrapment until there is an opportunity to have independence outside of marriage. Notice that we get Mrs. Mallard's name only later on in the piece. Her name is Louise. The idea is that she's only given a independent and personality and identity when she is widowed. The beginning of the story, she's known through her husband's surname and also the title of Mrs. Note that Mrs. denotes marital status in a way that Mr. does not. Miss and Mrs. were created to identify very quickly and clearly if female was single or married, was one of the reasons why Ms. was created, so that there wouldn't be an easy identification for marital status. But that term Ms. was not created for many decades later. And even the first name, Louise, and notice that Mrs. Mallard's sister is also introduced as Josephine, with just her first name. So one assumes that she's not in a marital relationship. But the names Josephine and Louise have male roots to them, Joseph and Louis. Again, sort of emphasizing the idea of the male dominance in society during this time period. We're introduced to the fact that she has heart trouble at the beginning, which is quite important. At the ending, we're told heart disease, but there is a distinction between the two. That heart trouble suggests some sort of emotional issue, while heart disease suggests some sort of physical issue. And she does have a troubled heart, as we learn as we read through the text, because of the situation of female during this time period and how marriage can be quite repressive. And in fact, she's even described as young, but her face bespoke repression, and we assume that's because of her marriage. And when she believes that she's widowed, there are all kinds of symbols of freedom that are presented to us as reader. An open window. A window is a way to look out into the outside world, especially because home was oftentimes seen as a place of entrapment for female, especially in the 1800s. Though even in A Sorrowful Woman, the bulk of that story occurred within the home. The fact that the window is open, which again suggests the idea of going outside. The roomy armchair in which she sits in. Not only is it a comfortable piece of furniture that is roomy, but an armchair is designed for one person. And now that she is a widow, she no longer has to think about being part of a couple or caretaking for someone else. She can care for herself. As she looks out into the window, she sees that open square. Again, all of these references to the idea of expansiveness and openness, suggestive of what her life will be like now as a widow. The fact that it's spring, and the seasons oftentimes represent emotional states, rebirth, renewal. The sparrows, again, I was suggesting all of this bird imagery can be seen as positive, spreading one's wings and flying, but can also be seen as negative, being entrapped. We think about mallard ducks, for instance. Basically, they are the colorful mallard ducks are the males, and it's the females that are rather bland. The idea, again, that perhaps preference is shown to male rather than to female during this time period. And not that this is the definitive analysis, but it certainly is a possibility, which is all that you need to come to when you are analyzing a text, is to come up with a interpretation that could be supported with evidence within the text itself. The idea that rain can be both negative, certainly, but also positive, because rain brings life and renewal and rebirth. And this rain is passing through. We're told that blue skies are beginning to show. Again, blue is supposed to be representational of something that's positive. And even the direction west, which could be associated with the westward expansion, the idea of seeking out a new life of independence, but also the direction of west, which is where the sun sets. This could be the ending of a life for Mrs. Mallard. And of course, when the sun sets, it rises again the next morning, and that the next morning for Mrs. Mallard could be new hope and new opportunity. Not that she's necessarily looking forward to this new opportunity. At first, she describes it as something that's creeping towards her. Creeping has a lot of negative associations. And she's not exactly sure what it is, and she's trying to beat it back with her will until eventually she succumbs. And she literally says under her breath, free, 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 free body and soul free. So obviously, she's feeling a sense of freedom at this particular point. Note that we are with her in this room as we're reading. Her family members are not, so they don't understand the epiphany that she is experiencing. And she does talk about her husband and that she did love him sometimes and that he had kind, tender hands. And this is important because this isn't a story that's a reflection about a husband who is in any way misusing or abusing her. This is more a story about the institution of marriage and what it does to female. And it also, I think, identifies the complexity of emotion. While it's possible to love, but only sometimes, rather than giving us a very clear cut black and white, which is what we saw with a Secret Sorrow, we see much more depth and much more complexity, ambiguity, even contradiction in these texts that we study that we call literature. Deconstructionists, if you'll remember, would talk about the contradiction as negating meaning in text. I think it helps to support meaning in text because ultimately human beings are contradictory. So I think that's the realistic element of literature. She says she'll live for herself rather than taking care of someone else. Again, this was an idea that we saw in The Sorrowful Woman. One of my favorite quotes, though, is less about her and more about the institution of marriage as a whole. That there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So this quote moves beyond the idea of female in marriage and talks about the idea of the institution of marriage and how both partners basically try to impose a will or dominate the other, which makes it, I think, a much more interesting text. Notice the assumption that marriage is a coupling of male and female, which I think is indicative of the time period in which this piece was written. So it would be very much in terms of the society of the time, very predictable that the union would be assumed to be heterosexual in nature. There is discussion of spring and summer days, again, all of those symbols that are associated with renewal, rebirth, the height of life. And then, of course, the ending, which is surprising because it turns out that her husband was not dead and that she ultimately is so overcome, she dies of, they indicate, joy that kills. What they think is that she's just so overwhelmed with happiness and with the shock of it all that she succumbs. And while there could be some truth to that, I mean, she did love him sometimes. The reality is that we know what the others don't, that she also is experiencing a sense of disappointment and frustration because the freedom that she thought she had is no longer something that she will have because now she's back in the position of marriage. And again, the focus is supposed to be on Mrs. Mallard. We don't learn much about her sister or Richards or even her husband. If the author had wanted us to focus on those elements, we would have gotten more information about them. So, again, you don't necessarily have to agree with the author's perspective about what marriage meant for female during the time. You don't necessarily have to sympathize or empathize with Mrs. Mallard, feeling a sense of relief and a sense of hope and optimism over the fact that she's widowed. But we do need to identify that this is where the author's sympathies lie before we can make a decision as to whether or not we agree or disagree with the author's perspective. And then I had to sign a rose for Emily, in part because there was an author interview at the ending of it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can have an author's perspective, but that necessarily does not mean that is the definitive or only perspective of a text. Because again, as long as we have evidence in a text to support a particular position, even if it contradicts what the author says the text is about, it is valid in a literary interpretation. Now, A Rose for Emily is very dark and macabre, and very deliberately so. It was written by William Faulkner, and it was written in a style called Gothic. And Gothic started in the 1800s with literary texts that you probably have some cultural, at least, awareness of. Texts like Dracula and Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They helped to establish the Gothic tradition. And also, the Gothic tradition is very closely tied with horror film. think I might have indicated that I also teach a class in horror film as well as Gothic literature. So both are of interest to me. And the idea is that the conventions that we associate with horror, the creepiness, the haunted castle, the possible supernatural, the darkness, the cobwebs, all of those were developed through that Gothic tradition. The thing is that even though it started in Britain, ultimately the United States was formed by Brits who came and formed the colonies, and they began writing in the Gothic tradition as well. And some authors that whom you may have heard of, such as Edgar Allan Poe, didn't necessarily set their texts in London or in Britain, but they kept it much more open-ended. And then there were other authors like William Faulkner, who wrote A Rose for Emily, who basically wanted to set their texts not in England, but in the southern United States. And they used the southern United States to sort of indicate a way that they could show that many of the elements associated with Gothic, the dark, decrepit, macabre nature, existed in the southern part of the United States. So this is a way that they could criticize some of the elements associated with the South. And that's exactly what we find with A Rose for Emily. Written in 1931, and the plot is deliberately confusing. So if you were reading it and you were wondering why it was so difficult to follow, it's because of the mixed chronology. We are not told the story in chronological order, and that's done very deliberately in order to hide the ending. And there really are two endings in this particular text, or two climaxes. Basically, the story, the plot, is fairly straightforward, and that, but again, it might not necessarily be easy to follow because we aren't told the story in chronological order. We're told about Miss Emily's funeral, but basically the backstory is that Miss Emily, as a young woman, was repressed by her father, who would not allow her to basically date and have social relationships. When her father died, she took it quite badly and was unable to release his body for 3 days. This turns out to be a bit of foreshadowing or a hint or a clue of some of her behavior that will occur later. But again, we may not necessarily be aware of this until we get to the ending of the story. Eventually, she does release her father's body after 3 days, and she comes out into society and begins dating. And the person that she dates, now that she no longer has her father to stop her from dating, but the person that she dates is quite surprising, Homer Barron, because first of all, he's a laborer while she is a Southern aristocrat. And secondly, he's from the North. He happens to be there in order to do some work and on the roads. And Miss Emily ends up having a very unusual relationship with him because it's not what the expectations would be in terms of her class or her status. And then at one point, she buys arsenic, and she is questioned by the pharmacist as to what use she would have with this because she's legally supposed to reply and give an answer. She doesn't respond, and then the druggist basically supplies an answer so that he doesn't have to confront her. And he says it's for rats. And then basically Homer Barron is seen entering into her house. We're told earlier that he's not really the marrying kind, and that he preferred men. That's less of a sexual statement and more of a statement about the fact that he's not going to be committing to any kind of a relationship with Miss Emily. And then ultimately he's seen going into her house, and then he disappears. And then afterwards there's a smell that comes out of her house, and again everyone is too intimidated to confront her, so the townspeople come and they try to cover up the smell. And then Miss Emily basically becomes a recluse. And at the ending of the story, we are told that after her funeral, they're able to enter her home. And what they discover is that in one of the bedrooms is the corpse of Homer, who basically has been killed by, or was killed by, Miss Emily years previous. So that's the first climax, if we hadn't figured it out, that she killed Homer. But now that I'm telling you the story in chronological order, it makes perfect sense that she would kill him. And then the second climax is that they find an iron gray hair next to the pillow of the bed in which Homer is lying in. In other words, Miss Emily has been lying next to that corpse. And since we find out that her hair does not turn gray until long after Homer disappears, that means she's been lying next to that corpse long after she has killed Homer. Again, very dark, very macabre. And rather than giving us the specifics of what Miss Emily did, um, it's left to our imagination, which is very much a common characteristic of Gothic or horror, that the best horror does not supply the monster. It lets your imagination supply that monster. So if you're familiar with the film Psycho, for instance, and its famous shower scene, audiences will swear they see a knife penetrate the skin of the woman who is taking a shower. It never happens. It's a marvel of editing, and that we see knife and skin, but there's never penetration. But it's our minds that supplies that. So in terms of thinking about the idea of the Southern Gothic, it is very critical, this story of Miss Emily, who represents a fallen Southern aristocrat. In fact, she's referenced as a fallen monument at the very beginning of the text. And the idea is that the world has moved on, but she's representational of a system that was built on slavery. And that ultimately, now that slavery has been made illegal, she still has perhaps her status, but she no longer has the financial independence that slavery afforded her, the privilege and the luxury. We see that in the decay and descent of her home. We see that in that ultimately she can't even afford to pay her taxes. And there's great reference to this, and that ultimately the townspeople, they, rather than confront her, again, this is something we see over and over again, because they are intimidated by her status as a Grierson. In other words, this was a well-respected family in previous days. But rather than confront her because she can't pay her taxes, what they do is that they create this fiction that her father had loaned the town money, and that ultimately this is their way of paying it back now that her father is dead, and that she need not pay her taxes, so that she can retain her dignity. And the thing is that eventually those individuals who try to protect her dignity, they pass away. And new members of the political world want their taxes. And she tells them that not only does she not need to pay taxes, but they should speak to Colonel Sartoris, who basically came up with this idea. But Colonel Sartoris has been dead for many, many years, which again shows that Miss Emily is not living in reality. In fact, she's living in a dead past, in a past that would have embrace things like China painting, which she keeps trying to teach, but people won't come anymore. She doesn't want mail delivery to her home. She's still writing in calligraphy. Her house is described as old and decrepit. Again, this idea of Faulkner criticizing the Old South, that is clinging on to a dead past and is refusing to move beyond that. And that Homer could be representational of this new North that's coming in and bringing progress. Um, I think that text is much more complex than what William Faulkner would suggest in the interview that he gives, that I wanted you to read, specifically when he's asked about the title, A Rose for Emily, and what does it mean. And he just basically says, oh, it's that the poor woman had no life at all. It's just a rose for Emily, that's all. However, I can't help but think that the title is much more meaningful than that. If we think about all of the associations with roses, definitely we usually think of flower, and a delicate flower at that. But keep in mind that roses have thorns, so they can also hurt. And I think that's also representational of Miss Emily, of somebody who's delicate, but also is quite dangerous. Um, Think about the occasions in which roses are oftentimes given, usually as a memorial. After all, the story begins and ends with Emily's funeral. Or it could also be as a symbol of love, and this is definitely a story about love, albeit a love gone awry. Um, And if we think about how color imagery is oftentimes connected with roses, most people will usually think of the red rose first, although roses are certainly in multiple colors. But think about it, the associations with red, with either passion or murder or blood. And all of those would work with the plot of what goes on with Rose for Emily. And roses are oftentimes kept as mementos. They're pressed and dried, and one might say that that's what she does with Homer himself, is that she keeps him as a memento, his corpse. So I think that all of those possibilities are much more interesting than what Faulkner said. I understand the arrogance of my position because Faulkner is ultimately the author of the text. And I could continue on by talking about how rose is a color. It's a mix of white and red. And in other words, it isn't necessarily the extreme of either the purity of white or the possible lust or passion associated with red. It's something in between. We're even told about the rose-colored curtains in her room at the ending. Rose is also the verb, the action for the past tense of rise. And this was a convention of the Southern society for gentlemen in particular to rise when a woman would walk into a room. So this is something they used to do, rose. And again, this is something that perhaps they aren't doing anymore, rising, because Miss Emily no longer has the status that she would have had in the world of slavery. Think about those southern plantations that basically is what Miss Emily would have been living off of in terms of her life of privilege and her relatives before her. The idea that a Rose for Emily, I think, has more complexity than what Faulkner suggested, of course, could be for a multitude of reasons. Notice that the Faulkner interview occurs many years after the actual text Rose for Emily, so it could be a question of him not quite remembering. It also is a possibility that he was playing with the interviewer and that he didn't necessarily want to give too much away, letting us as readers sort of struggle with it. Or perhaps he thought that he could give just about any answer and we would spend a good amount of time trying to contemplate whether or not that answer had some validity to it, when he was just, as he says, just writing a story. And he doesn't negate the idea that there is possible symbolism, but he says it was no intention of the author to say, let's see, let me have one represent the North, let me have the other represent the South. Even his answer strikes me as interesting because he refers to the author rather than to himself. He's speaking about himself in the third person, which is somewhat distancing. But I thought that A Rose for Emily would be an interesting story for us to read, if for no other reason because it has William Faulkner's perspective, or some of his perspectives, with an interview that he gave about the story. But think about all of the foreshadowing that's in the story. The family also has insanity within it, a little clue that we're told that ultimately becomes much more significant when we see Miss Emily's actions. The denial of her father's death. In fact, she holds on to him for 3 days, and 3 is an important number from a Christian perspective. And I think it's quite interesting that Faulkner talks about from his perspective, this was about somebody who was committing a sin that you're not supposed to kill. Buying arsenic, and that the druggist writes in the purpose for killing rats. Some might say that Homer is a rat for not committing to Miss Emily. Homer's disappearance, the smell, and how she basically becomes a recluse. And you can see in the notes below, I've also talked about death in terms of not literal death of Miss Emily or her father or Homer, but also symbolic death, about the fall of a Southern aristocracy, and that she's refusing to move forward into the future and living in a dead past. Notice the use of the N-word that appears in this piece. And now she has a servant rather than a slave. But again, it also gives us a sense of time. Now, this story has come under criticism because of that perhaps it is not appropriate to read because of its use of the N word. That said, I think it's important to understand the historical context, and that makes, in my opinion, the story all the more powerful, and that it shows, again, the critique that Faulkner was making about this society. Lots of symbolism, I suggest, in the decaying house to represent a decaying Southern lifestyle. And I had asked, which story did you prefer, even though I hadn't really talked about them? Story of an Hour or Rose for Emily, and why? And you'll notice that the three stories coming up that were scheduled for today are very different from one another, and I did that very deliberately. Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, which I will talk about briefly today, and then much more in depth next class. So again, we're still behind with our syllabus because I'm still hopeful that we might have some more participation in class. But certainly I will be catching up very soon, so keep up with our course outline. I'll also be talking a little bit more about journals and paper assignments as we continue on. But Young Goodman Brown, I wanted to assign because, if for nothing else, it's a representation of life in New England, which is where we live. And it's very important to know about the Puritans for Young Goodman Brown. This was a very strict religious philosophy in Britain, and they were basically persecuted, is one of the reasons why they came to the American colonies to form a New England. And in fact, they're probably best known for the hypocrisy of trying to escape religious persecution and then engaging in religious persecution themselves for those individuals who did not follow Puritanism, specifically in Salem, Massachusetts, which comes with its own history and folklore. And they were responsible for the Salem witch trials, where they oftentimes identified women, more often than not, who were seen as outsiders in society or who were not following the Puritan ethos, which was one in which there was either complete holiness or evil and nothing in between. It should be a life of work, and it should be a life devoid of pleasure, because that ultimately would come in the afterlife, pleasure. And Young Goodman Brown is a wonderful example of the history of Salem, as well as a critique of the hypocrisy associated with the Puritans. I know the language is somewhat difficult to read because it is from the 1800s. Keep in mind that the story was written for an audience from the 1800s, so the language would be much easier for them. And it's very symbolic. And in fact, it is entirely symbolic. So while we can read Young Goodman Brown as a specific story of an individual's journey, what we can also see is that Young Goodman Brown is representational for the journey that we all take as humanity when we have to confront the idea of sin and hypocrisy. So this is an allegorical story when basically everything within the story has some representational significance. And then Soldier's Home. Now, this was written by Ernest Hemingway in 1925. It's a much more contemporary piece. I think you'll find the language to be much more accessible. And it is the story of a veteran who is returning home after war. In this instance, it happens to be World War I. And about the difficulties of reintegrating back into society. And while this is a topic that still exists today, think about how little understanding would have existed in 1925 when there wasn't even a term such as post-traumatic stress disorder. It was known as shell shock. And what we see is this soldier who basically is returned home to his original birthplace and to his family, but yet he's not home because he's not understood. And we see the struggles and the conflicts and the battles he experiences. Not just has he returned from a literal conflict and battle, the war, but there are battles that he has with his society, his family, and even within himself. And then finally, Battle Royal, from a book entitled Invisible Man. And I knew we wouldn't have the time to read the novel Invisible Man, but we could at least read one of its opening chapters, which appeared as a short story. And basically, what we're told in Battle Royal is why this person feels invisible, because this person is black and is not seen for his individuality. He's merely seen based on the color of his skin. Keep in mind the time in which this piece was written, 1952, when racism was alive and rampant. That's not to say that racism is not alive and rampant today, but even more so in the time of segregation. And this invisible man is basically put into a literal boxing match for the entertainment of some of the leading citizens of his town. And he engages in this boxing match in order to be able to have the opportunity afterwards to read his prize winning graduation speech, hoping that he can earn some respect and honor from them. And of course, that's not going to be happening because they degrade him and humiliate him. And then ultimately, after he gives his speech, they reward him with a scholarship. But what seems to be a positive is really going to be a negative, and he has a dream at the ending that would suggest that when his grandfather is basically taunting him. And again, we see another use of the N word. And what we don't know is what happens in the novel afterwards. But basically, what we find out in the novel is that he does go to college, and it ends up not being a positive experience for him. And in fact, I'll tell you a little bit more about the novel next class as well, just to give you an idea of what happens to him, because we really hear his entire story when we read the novel. But again, we're only reading Battle Royal, one of the opening chapters, and this is the opening chapter in which he is reflecting back as an older individual on his youth when he graduated from high school, where he was given the opportunity to present his speech to the leading citizens of the day, his graduation speech, because it was considered to be so esteemed. And he's hopeful that if he's able to deliver his speech, despite the degradation and humiliation that he's put through prior, that he can earn the respect of his society. And again, his dream suggests that's not going to happen, and that's exactly what we see when we read the novel. And we'll talk about all three of these particular stories next class. And then that will mean that we have just two stories left to end our short story unit, Girl and Popular Mechanics. Both of these are very short stories. Just a page or so long, much more contemporary. Girl was written in the 1970s and Popular Mechanics in the 1980s. And they both are rather experimental in terms of their storytelling style. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to give these pieces, is because I wanted you to see the traditional way of telling a story, the early days of short story, and see how authors have sort of taken that and made liberties, or taken liberties with that in order to create their own style. I think of music being very similar in some respects, that musicians are influenced by the musicians of the past, so that the musicians of the past are usually seen as much more conservative, and the more modern musicians are seen as more experimentational, that they're taking the conservative rules that have been established and playing with them. And I think you can see that with literature and with dance and with most art, actually. So I'll also talk a little bit about, as I had indicated, some upcoming assignments that you will have. First, a journal, where I'm going to be asking you to select 3 short stories from the short story unit and to respond in about a page or so for each of those short stories. So you would have about 3 pages in total in response if you selected 3 short stories. Of your thoughts and observations, perhaps you could address some of the questions at the ending of the text. Certainly, you can use these class videos and the class discussion forums as ways to inspire you as well. They're very informal. I'm not grading for grammar or mechanics, just for content. You could think of it as a conversation on paper that I'm just asking that you submit via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, because that works best for my grading program. And then I will respond in turn with comments as if we were having a conversation on paper. Return that back to you via email. And hopefully that would at least inspire you for pursuing a more formal writing assignment, which would be writing an academic paper, which we will also be talking about. And I will give some suggested paper topics, but you can also create your own paper topic. And as long as you get it approved by me. And the papers are approximately 4 to 5 pages, a more formal analysis of a particular idea or theme within one of the pieces of literature. And in fact, what you might find is that as you're writing your journals, you'll have some ideas of how you could pursue a paper. And in fact, you can certainly use some of your reflections in your journals in an academic paper if that's appropriate. An academic paper would be evaluated not just for content, but for grammar and mechanics. And that means it would be graded formally on a letter scale of ABC, as opposed to a checkmark scale, which is how you will be graded for your journals. However, you have the option of rewriting that first paper after I've reviewed it for grammar, mechanics, and content, and I've given it back to you with some comments. And if my comments aren't enough for you, you can certainly make an appointment with me, and then you can incorporate that into a revision, submit in your revision along with your original version with my comments, and you would get the higher of the two grades. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to hand in your revision, but certainly the sooner the better. So you can, if you wanted to, think of that first paper as a kind of draft in the sense that everyone in class has the option of rewriting the first paper. The second paper would be due towards the ending of the semester, so you probably wouldn't have a chance to rewrite it. That said, if you could submit it in early enough, we could negotiate, so that would be a possibility. Basically, your second paper will be on the second unit that we talk about in class. After we are completed with short story, we will move into drama. And then finally, our third unit in class will be on poetry. You won't have a paper due on poetry because this is what we're going to be doing at the very ending of the semester. But your final exam will be devoted to poetry, where I'm going to be selecting a handful of the poems that we discussed and ask you to respond to 2 of them in depth. And that'll be your final exam that you would have 24 hours to complete. If you were taking the class in person, you would have 2 hours or so to complete it. But it's open book, open notes. So basically, you can utilize all of the resources that you would have used ahead of time. And for all 3 of these units, short story, drama, and ultimately poetry, you will be writing these informal journals where I'm asking you to respond to 3. And again, the formal papers would be for short story and for drama. And then ultimately, the final exam would be what would be focused on for poetry. So I will continue on next class talking about Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, and then putting some closure on Girl and Popular Mechanics. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.